Hi, Kara.
On to Build Maine. So Build Maine has traditionally been an in-person conference held annually in June, but 2020 is going to be a little different. So it's our 7th year, and we just wanted to thank everyone for attending our virtual conference with the purpose of bringing together all of the people in the act of building Maine cities and towns. We appreciate your continued support and your willingness to roll with us. Just a quick note before our morning coffee talk, and then Jim will take it away. Build Maine is about pushing boundaries. That said, we want to create a culture of openness and kindness. So try not to put people in boxes. Try not to divide people with words and labels. We try to improve our ability to focus on what connects us to each other, the priorities we hold in common. While being more kind, we must also be able to challenge ourselves and each other to do better work. And that's why we're here. We can and must be honest and speak directly to each other, but in a way that's kind. So with that said, what is Coffee Talk? This is a half an hour before we get going with the presentation from Mike Lydon, which we're really excited about. Want to give a shout out and thank you to Developers Collaborative. I don't know if anybody has their Developers Collaborative mugs, so I'm missing mine. There's Kara's, the classic. Next Build Maine that we are able to host in person, we hope that you take one away from us so that we can wash fewer of them year after year. Anyway, the Coffee Talk is meant to build a culture of sharing between professions and disciplines. We build our places through shared knowledge, relationships, and attitudes. So during this time, we invite people to share what's going on in informal conversations. I know that's a bit difficult via Zoom, but do your best. Feel free to jump in and say hello, interject questions, and provide updates on what you're doing and how you're doing. So with that said, Jim Tassi from Bicycle Coalition of Maine will kick things off, and Jim will be sharing street projects that happen here in Maine. Jim Tassi is Assistant Director in charge of Advocacy and Education at BCM. And again, this is an informal conversational time, so feel free to unmute yourself and jump into the conversation with Jim if you have any questions, comments, thoughts. Also, we'll be monitoring the group chat, so if you don't feel like you want to unmute, feel free to send your question in the chat and we will interject for you. So yeah, I guess that's where
Mandy and Jim, I just want to make one little technical thing. I did unmute everyone. So that's just so that the lines can be open for this portion of the program. So I would suggest if you don't have comments to put yourself on mute so that we don't get background noise. And otherwise you're ready to go, and then unmute when you want to speak or use the chat feature.
Great, thanks, Ann.
Awesome.
And sorry, Jim, huge thanks to Ann and the Maine Downtown Center and Maine Development Foundation for hosting us week after week. We've hosted, I don't even know how many webinars, so maybe 8, 10 over the past couple of weeks, months, and it's been instrumental in keeping us going. So thanks so much, Ann. Great.
Ready for me to step in?
Yes.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Tassi. I'm the Assistant Director of the Bicycle Coalition of Maine. I'm pleased and honored to be participating in Build Maine again. This virtual format is something we're all getting used to. Second Zoom call of the day for me. And what I wanted to talk about this morning was sort of a warm-up to Mike Lydon's conversation about street activation and tactical urbanist activities. I'm going to share my screen and run you through a few images of projects that we've been doing in Maine really for the last 5 years. I'm going to start with one that we did last year that really was the most studied and arguably the most successful project we did. So I'm going to start with a great success story and then just show you some other images of things that we've done. I'm going to, Mandy or Ann or Kara, you know, if you see people wanting to ask questions, I'm not going to be monitoring that. So, you know, you might need to break in and let me know. I'm going to share my screen now and hopefully all goes well. See, that's not the first picture I wanted you to see. That's the first picture I wanted you to see. So we call our Tactical Urbanist campaign Imagine People Here. It started out being Imagine Bikes Here, was launched in 2014, 15 with a grant from People for Bikes. And the image that you see here is actually the first bike lane pop-up that we ever tried to paint. I used an athletic line striper to paint a line on Cottage Road in South Portland. I was accused of being intoxicated at the time because I didn't really have the methodology for painting a perfectly straight line worked out at that point yet. But nonetheless, it was a huge success. We were still working out here when these folks showed up. And it really drove home for us the power of demonstration projects. The city of South Portland almost immediately added this bike lane to its striping plan for the years going forward. It's been striped ever since as a formal bike lane for the city. So it goes to show that it is possible to do a demonstration project and really have a transition to a permanent installation. And I think this was what really got us excited about the potentials here to change the conversation around road culture in Maine.
Jim,
Hey, Jim,
Yes.
would you mind putting it in either presenter view or full screen?
Yep. I can
That'd be great.
I was just going to ask Jim, how much did that project cost?
That project did not cost much. It was basically, I want to say maybe $300 worth of paint because we were just using spray cans of paint. We did have to pay $400 for police traffic control. South Portland at that point was not willing to donate the police time. So because this is a pretty busy street, we wanted to have good traffic control. We actually had we had a whole safety plan set up. We were using all kinds of signs, all kinds of cones. This is if you look in the background of this image, I see with the cursor, you can see some of our cones are still up there. I will begin by saying, if you do these things in the street, it's important that you try to adhere to the kind of traffic control processes that are outlined in the MUTCD. Apparently the guy who works for OSHA lived in this neighborhood, and Doug Howard, who is the DPW director for South Portland, said, use a lot of cones, make sure you got the signs, have traffic control, because this guy could come along and issue you a fine for not actually complying with best practices for, doing work in the street. So this one in particular, because it was so high profile and such a busy road, we actually spent the money to make sure we had traffic control. But in subsequent projects, we've had the towns donate that stuff. So this next image is from a project that we did in North Yarmouth. This is about halfway through the installation process here. And what this was a kind of trying to reclaim Route 115 in North Yarmouth, which is a rural highway that runs through a village that's really trying to reclaim that road to turn into a main street. And what we did is we created we got permission, amazingly, to put down a temporary crosswalk, and Maine DOT actually provided signs that the town of North Yarmouth put up, just so it was all in compliance with their rules. We used temporary parking stops to create safe landings so that, no car could encroach on the lane. You can't see the other one's not done yet. Because we were messing around with the shoulder a little bit with the delineator and the planter, we used shared lane markings to indicate that any bicyclist should take the lane at this point going through. And we used the R16 sign to create kind of a gateway here. The idea here is that this center sign with the delineator on the edge of the road, even though it didn't narrow the road at all, it created enough visual friction that people were like, oh my God, what have you done to the road? You've slowed things down so much. This is a similar treatment we did a little further up the road. This is what we used as a sort of gateway to the entire area. And this is Clark from North Yarmouth, who was super helpful in helping us do this. But this gateway treatment, where you basically put delineators on a center line and on the fog line, and you can actually use them on the other fog line as well, has been studied pretty extensively in Michigan and been found to drastically improve compliance with speed limits and improve yields at crosswalks. So that's why we did the kind of gateway treatment. Here, where we have this. The idea here is that we're going to improve yields at the crosswalk. This is just so we kind of made this the gateway to the entire segment, so the people experienced friction going in and they knew they were entering some kind of new context that was going to slow people down. And indeed, we found that this had a pretty profound effect on speeds. We had almost a 4 mile per hour reduction in average speed. And even better, we took a situation in which 33% of operators were adhering to the speed limit and actually improved compliance to 80%. So we get a 50% improvement in compliance with the speed limit. The town of Yarmouth, or North Yarmouth rather, was really excited about the project, and they're already talking about doing some sort of hardscape version of this. And you know, prior to COVID, we were having conversations about, you know, reinstalling the temporary measures, and that's some conversations I need to follow up with. But this was just another real eye-opening demonstration that showed, you know, this cost $1,500, and we got just huge improvements in compliance with the speed limit. We got tons of positive feedback from pedestrians who lived in the area of the project, and predictably, we got a certain amount of hate and flack from drivers who felt like we were, you know, we drastically had narrowed the road. And it was, you know, it was interesting because we actually had not narrowed the road a bit. We actually just put stuff right on the fog lines, but by carrying those edge lines up into the vertical space, we created enough friction to really change driver behavior. So this is a treatment that we're planning to re-implement in a few places around the state this year. This is an old, yes.
And one more question on that one.
Sure.
That was a state road, correct?
This was a state road. We had to go through DOT hoops and permissions. Steve Landry came down and looked at the plan before we implemented it. And, you know, DOT was fantastic and very supportive of this. And they're paying attention. So this was a great one to have a win on. So again, that's the gateway to the whole treatment. This is an early iteration of just a traffic calming installation, similar to the gateway thing. Again, you can actually see there is an R16 sign here in the middle, but again, just creating a little choke down as people approach a crosswalk enables, you know, pedestrians to move a little bit further out so that they're more visible, and it slows traffic down because they feel like they're threading a needle. This installation eventually had another delineator about where this crack is and on the other side, so as to keep drivers from parking too close to the crosswalk. And that was, you know, this was very temporary. This was just for Bike Maine when we were in Rangeley. But, you know, this kind of installation is something that there's a lot of interest in around the state. This costs under $200 to do. So it's super inexpensive. It can have a huge impact on compliance with the yield law, and it calms traffic very generally in the area. This is another pop-up project. Last year in Sanford, Lee Burnett, who's an advocate that Kara's worked with as well, wanted to paint a bikeway. We actually painted bike lanes on one section of the road, and then we actually painted shared lane markings for about another 1.5 miles to create a bikeway. And it was, you know, it's arguably the longest continuous bikeway on street in the state. Again, the DPW guy down there loved it and is very supportive, and I expect that this is going to be made permanent and I'll be in Sanford on Monday, so I'll ask more questions about it. Here's another view of that. This street was really pretty narrow, and getting some markings out that just indicated that bike riders use the street, made a huge impact on drivers' awareness of other users being out there. This, so BCM has a stencil. If anyone wants to do something like this, we're happy to loan our stencil or go and help you paint it. This was, again, a couple $100 worth of spray paint, and having a pickup truck to move the stencil, and two or three people is all it really takes to do it. But again, it demonstrates that you can add elements to the road that improve the comfort and safety of vulnerable users, and it demonstrates that civilization doesn't go off the rails if you do these things, because sometimes people are so change averse they don't want to try anything. And this was done. This paint is semi-permanent. It wears off fairly quickly, but calling it temporary gives people a lot of comfort with it, so they can see it and see, oh, okay, yeah, it's not a big deal. Maybe we should do that again. And you can see the next one right up here, a little further along. This is another project that we did last year. This was a curb extension, changing the radius of a turn in Brunswick. These were both DOT roads, so again, we had to go through some DOT hoops, but you can't really see it very clearly. Right here, if you can see my cursor, there is a crosswalk. And the problem with this particular location is that people, because of the radius of the turn, people were able to make this turn at like 35 miles an hour and then come flying into the crosswalk, which is hard after. And so what we did, working in partnership with Bowdoin and City of Brunswick, we changed the geometry of this turn so as to slow people down. This was sufficiently successful that the town of Brunswick immediately bought all the delineators, and my understanding is that I'm not sure if they're going to use those delineators again right here, but they're looking to experiment with other traffic calming installations around the town. Okay, so now I have to just pause for a second and go to a different set of images. Are there any questions while I'm doing this?
Yeah, actually. So Ken has asked, we've heard a lot about the federally designated bike route. Did this initiative take advantage of the federal program?
It did not, although we are currently supporting an effort on the bike route BR 501 up in the county, where there's an effort to get some grant funding to create some shoulders and bike lanes on a segment of that route. This route was not part of BR1, so we would have leveraged that if we could have, for sure. This image, I'll go to full screen again. This is probably one of our most impactful and successful projects prior to the Yarmouth project. So this is a treatment that's referred to variously as dashed bike lanes, advisory bike lanes, or advisory shoulders. It is a treatment that is outlined and actually detailed in the Federal Highway Rural Design Guide. And basically what you do here is you drop a dashed line. This is 5 feet from the edge of pavement, and what you leave in the middle is for the cars. And in this case, that space was, I want to say, 13 feet. And the sign here, if you can see my cursor moving, this is a sign that we saw this sign used on a similar project in Hanover, New Hampshire, and created the sign to inform operators that this is, yes, still two-way traffic, and it provides a little bit of instruction for users. The two-way sign is required under the federal highway guidance for using this particular facility. This is an experimental facility, and you're supposed to actually request permission to experiment to use it. In this case, Scarborough was like, yeah, we don't want to do that. So they just went ahead and did it on the local road. This is the road that connects the Eastern Trail from coming off the Eastern Marsh to what's going to be the other end of it at the Gap that'll go all the way to Wainwright Fields. And so it gets a ton of pedestrian and bike traffic. there's a condo and mixed use neighborhood on both sides further down the road. Gets a lot of traffic. Residents love it. It's been repainted now 3 or 4 years running. So this is one that
Hey, Jim, what's the length of that treatment?
this treatment goes for about a half mile in the first segment, and then it's got another probably quarter-mile segment. So it's about 3/4 of a mile total. We've done similar projects to this now in Gray. Yarmouth has done, we did one, for Yarmouth, and Yarmouth has since done another one, and now I'm in negotiations with their team up there, and we're going to do one that's going to be almost a mile and a half through a residential neighborhood where the residents are complaining about speeding traffic and there aren't sidewalks and there's no place to walk. And so we're going to use a combination of dashed lines and delineators to create some gateways and slope things down. Here, I'll show you that right now.
As we were getting checked out and everything, so.
So I don't know how well you can see this. Let me go again to full screen. So this is what we're planning for Yarmouth this summer. We haven't fully got it permitted yet, but we're moving forward well. We got a great team working up there. Same idea. This gives you a view from above where you have the dotted line on the edge of the road. On the curves here, what we're thinking of doing is experimenting with delineators to prevent cars from cutting that corner too close and encroaching on the lane. And one of the things that we're going to be adding to treatments like this is a double line in the beginning for the first 50 feet or so, maybe less, to indicate very clearly to drivers this is still a two-way context. And that's an idea that Tom Nosel from Ransom Engineering gave me. He had found it referenced in another resource. But the idea behind this is that we're going to just give people who live on this street a place to walk. It's a fairly thickly settled spot, and I'm zoomed in, but you can see how many driveways there are. We were out walking these streets, just taking measurements, and people were coming out and just voluntarily like, "What are you going to do to slow the cars down here?" And so when we told them we were going to try to do something, they were more than supportive. And so we're expecting that this is going to go forward and be a successful project. But stay tuned. I hope to be able to report on that, maybe at next year's Build Maine.
And Jim, can you just explain again, how does that change the dynamic on the street between cars and other users?
Well, what it does is it provides, a space for people who aren't in a car to operate. So, it's very similar to just having a fog line on the edge of the road. You've got a shoulder space that people can walk and bike in. And in this case, it's tried to be spelled out specifically as a multi-use advisory lane. And I've actually started the conversation with the DOT about permitting in some contexts using both a bicycle and a pedestrian symbol in a facility like this, because this is very much not a bike lane specifically. This is as much for pedestrians as it was for people walking. Unfortunately, under current MUTCD guidelines and Maine DOT policy, if you put a stencil in as a bike lane, it becomes a bike lane, a preferential facility for that, and then the pedestrians are kind of encroaching on a bike space. If you put nothing in there, which is what we compromised with here, you have a situation that's, just a dotted line on the edge of the road. So I actually like the idea of putting in stencils because I think it provides more emphasis that this is a space for people walking and biking. And the cars, as the image indicates, they have to kind of share this space. So the idea is that the cars are riding more or less in the middle of the lane. And when they encounter another car, they slow down, and if it's safe to do so, they move to the right and pass. So the whole idea is to calm traffic down and to really reallocate some of the pavement for use by pedestrians and bicyclists, vulnerable users. And this has been really popular. Even DOT has been asking me to plan some of these. We're going to be doing one of these, I think, later this year in Kittery, where they have a lot of cut-through traffic, and they want to do something to kind of slow the traffic down and improve conditions for people walking and biking. But you can see if you were to add a delineator here And
There's two
here,
other questions on this. Have you worked
you could create that gateway context. Go ahead.
Have you worked with local cogs on any of these transportation projects?
So we used to work with PACs on this stuff, and some of this stuff, you know, we would actually build to PACs. You know, at the moment, we don't have a contract with PACs. You know, we, as a matter of courtesy, will inform local cogs, but, you know, we primarily work with municipalities because if it's a local road, they're the people who are, you know, most responsible. And we work with the DOT when it's a DOT road. But we'd welcome the opportunity to partner more with cogs.
And then another one is, someone says they assume the Bowdoin Street project would have no on-street parking.
That's an issue that we're still going to have to work through the public process on. The police chief has already raised some concerns about parking. There are a lot of driveways, and so it seems to me that you know, it probably would work. You know, even if you didn't have parking on those streets, but we all know in this line of work that parking is sacred, and the perception that we'd be taking any away will be problematic. So that's one of the things that we're gonna have to work through. But ideally, right, if this goes in, you don't park there. And this is actually my vehicle down there. So, and I think I'm way off the edge of the road there, but yeah, I was thinking about not parking in the facility.
What's the sort of max ADT on these treatments?
So federal highway guidelines are, you know, this is for 6,000 and under. So this is pretty low volume. But there are a lot of roads in Maine that are 6,000 and under. And this street, which actually, and 6,000 is actually, you know, it's a significant number of cars per day. This road, I think, is like 4,000 a day, and so it gets pretty regular traffic. It's got communities. I mean, you know, it's got residences on it, so there's people who live here. But yeah, this is a facility you would only try on kind of a low volume road. You can see sight lines are really important. Like one of the things that we're still kind of working through with the Yarmouth project is, you know, the curves. So what we might do instead of let me just bring that back up. Instead of using the delineators on the curves, now, I guess that's not going to work. We might just drop the dashed lines and put a center line back in or something like that. So, but you want to think about sight lines, you want to think about speed, and you want to think about volume. And this is really only, you know, suitable for a road that's 35 miles per hour and under. Let's see what else. So this is another bikeway project. This is a pop-up bikeway that we did again as part of Bike Maine up in Rockland, where we stenciled you know, a bikeway on some quiet residential streets that were overly wide and again, well received. I don't think I have any pictures of it. We did gateway treatments in Rockland as well, using the delineator and the R16. The R16 sign means, you know, it's the sign that says yield to pedestrians in a marked crosswalk. We had a little disagreement with the police chief up there, who was not willing to leave those signs in the middle of the road, which is specifically required by federal highway guidance and the MUTCD. And despite them hearing from both the DOT and the local federal highway folks, Rockland just was not comfortable leaving those signs out there. And we're continuing to have conversations with them about traffic calming. But this part of the project was non-controversial, and just got some volunteers. This is how you do it. You set it up and you paint it. It's easy. And
Hey,
when it's done.
Jim, we're gonna have to transition here in about 30 seconds over to our main program.
I'm just out of slides, so perfect timing. I got more, but that's all I loaded up. If you have more questions, I'll put my address in the chat. I can be reached at jim@bikemaine.org, and don't hesitate to reach out to me if you've got questions about any of these installations or about having us come to your community and discuss putting in a demonstration project. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for your questions, and have a great day.
Thanks, Jim. That was great. So to our scheduled programming. So welcome to Build Maine. Build Maine has traditionally been an in-person conference, and apologies if you were here for the coffee talk and you've heard part of the spiel already, but welcome to everybody who's just joined. Build Maine's traditionally been an in-person conference held annually in June. 2020 is our 7th year, but it will be a bit different. We want to thank everyone for attending our virtual conference with the purpose of bringing together all of the people in the act of building Maine cities and towns. We appreciate your continued support and your willingness to roll with us in this new format. My name is Mandy Reynolds, and I'm the Executive Director of Build Maine. I also have Cashel Stewart and Jasmine Olens on the line and on video, who have been working with Build Maine this year and helping us pull together this event, as well as Kara Wilbur, the chair of the conference. So huge thanks to Ann Ball at Maine Downtown Center and Maine Development Foundation. Their support throughout the last couple of months and years has been just fantastic. So as you may know, Build Maine's changed formats this year. So we're starting today with a bonus speaker to kick off the Build Maine 2020 conference with a series of webinars. We will have 4 more webinars continuing on each Thursday in June. And we're gonna repost the Build Maine program in the chat box in a little bit. If you haven't had access to that, you can also find the program at build-maine.com. So we want to start by thanking all of our sponsors who have allowed us to keep Build Maine going this year and to bring great speakers and content to you over the next month. So a big thank you to our co-hosts, Maine Municipal Foundation, Maine Real Estate and Development Association, or MERIDA, Maine Downtown Center, and AARP Maine. Our platinum sponsor, AARP, big thanks to Lori Parham at AARP Maine. Our gold sponsors are Bangor Savings Bank, Developers Collaborative, Maine Downtown Center, and Maine DOT. Our silver sponsors include Bicycle Coalition of Maine, thanks Jim, Portland Trails, Principal, Ransom Engineering, and Treehouse Institute. Our bronze sponsors are Bernstein Schur, Maine Community Development Association, Massway Development, and Porta & Co. Real Estate. Our city sponsors include Augusta, Bangor, Gardner, Hollowell, Lewiston, Saco, Sanford, and South Portland. And our town sponsors, Bath is also included in the city sponsors. Our town sponsors include Brunswick, Bridgeton, Camden, Rumford, Topsom, and Yarmouth. And our additional partners include Maine Association of Planners, Grow Smart Maine, Maine Public Works Association, and Passive House Maine. So please feel free to check out the chat box for updates on professional education credits. I'll be posting that in just a moment. We have credits that have been approved for a variety of professions. We're still waiting on a few, so be sure to check out your profession. And we will post the sign up link as well. We are still accepting virtual sponsorships for the event. So this is just the first of 5 weeks of Build Maine. So we get to extend it out a little bit longer, which is kind of fun. So please contact me with any questions. I'll drop my email in the chat box as well. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box. We will be monitoring those and interject them as we can, or you know, Mike has about 45-minute question and answer period at the end of his presentation. So to introduce Mike Lydon. Mike Lydon is the principal of the Street Plans Collaborative. I would urge you to check out their social media and website because there's some great photos of the projects they've done. As an internationally recognized planner, writer, and advocate for livable cities, his work has been featured by NPR, the New York Times, CNN Headline News, The Atlantic Cities, Planetizen, Grist, Salon, Next City, Architect Magazine, and Streets Blog, among other publications. Along with Tony Garcia, Mike is the author of Tactical Urbanism, Short-Term Action for Long-Term Change, which was published by the Island Press in March 2015. Mike is also the creator and primary author of the Open Streets Project, and with author Julie Flynn, the editor and co-creator of Mercado, lessons from 20 markets across South America. Mike collaborated with Andres Duani and Jeff Speck in writing the Smart Growth Manual, published by McGraw-Hill in 2009, and honored by Planetizen as one of the top 10 planning books of 2010. So before launching Streets Plan in 2009, Lydon worked for Smart Growth Vermont, the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition, and Ann Arbor's Get Downtown program. From 2006 to 2009, Lydon worked for Duani, Plater, Zyberk and Company, an international leader in the practice of smart growth planning, design, and research techniques. At DPZ, Mike worked extensively on Miami 21, the recipient of the American Planning Association's 2011 National Planning Excellence Award, and contributed to several other research and project initiatives. Mike was selected in 2009 as one of 34 urban vanguards by Next City magazine. He received a BA in American Cultural Studies from Bates College and a master's in urban planning from the University of Michigan. Mike is a CNU accredited professional, and he encourages you to trade 4 wheels for 2. So just wanted to say thank you to everyone joining today, and I'd like to pass it over to Mike.
Great, thank you, Mandy. You read the long bio. You didn't have to do that this morning, but thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully, you all can see that really quickly. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Believe it or not, I just got home from Maine 2 days ago. We spent the long Memorial Day weekend, our family, in a little cottage so that we could see my parents, who we haven't seen since November, and we were physically distanced, and it was a little bit odd and strange, but it was wonderful to be home in Damascata and in Bristol. So we're back in New York City now, and I'm happy to be with you from my bedroom, the home office / bedroom. And I'll be sharing some of the work that we've been delivering with cities recently, and give you an overview of Tactical Urbanism. I think a lot of you know what this is by now. For those who are just listening to Jim and his great projects, clearly there's an understanding of the definition and the approach. But I think what's really interesting is how this is now evolving from something that was like a nice to have to what cities are viewing as an absolutely essential need to have in terms of responding to COVID-19, and then looking towards recovery, and hopefully not sliding back, but being prepared to do that and being more nimble in how we approach our public spaces, our transportation networks, and how we move people around our communities. So with that, briefly, we are based in Miami and New York City. Our firm's about 11 years old now. We work on a lot of different types of projects, primarily for cities and regional governments. They'll certainly work a lot with nonprofits and private companies as well. Our passion is for streets and for how people move in streets and use streets and can enjoy a life in their community via their streets, which is the primary open spaces that we have in our communities. Like I mentioned, I'm from Damascata. I grew up there with it's always nice to meet all of you. And before I jump into the presentation here, I looked through, I kind of trolled through the people who are on the list here. I see a lot of familiar names. So I wish I could be with you in person, but hopefully soon. As I moved to Miami in 2007 after grad school, I got engaged with that really exciting project, which was Miami 21. And I got engaged with a lot of projects that were also similar in nature or scale in terms of being long-term, big vision, and take many, many, many years and many, bumps and bruises along the way politically to come to fruition, if at all. I think we have a long history of this in our cities, of this being our primary approach to making change. And I think it's really challenging to have the profession oriented in that way, generally when many communities don't have the resources to think with millions and millions of dollars. We have to think about, the thousands of dollars, the hundreds of dollars even with some of our projects. And because of these big budgets and really long timelines, projects are really slow and they're really expensive. And we find that over time, public process can feel like, or it does, lack transparency, which breeds a lot of mistrust in our communities about change. And that's really difficult when we have a lot of urgent needs to overcome and to deal with in our communities. And that trust is something that we need to build. So what I found in my work early on, leaving grad school, going from an academic setting to a real world setting, was that the planning field was largely static and inflexible as it relates to design and bringing people along with change and how change can be beneficial for everybody. And what really brought that home for me was through advocacy that I was doing in the city of Miami. And that was, this picture here is an event from downtown Miami, which is in 2009, which is when we just shut down a few streets to traffic and let people come out and walk and bike and be with their neighbors in their community. And it was a completely transformational moment for, I think, the city and for people to see their city in a new way, that they could be flexible with the use of their streets, that it does not have to be all or nothing when it comes to managing the use of our streets. It doesn't have to be all cars or all people, that we can be flexible. And it helped me see a new way forward about how just giving people the experiences of change can be really, really beneficial. That people can come along with you in a community and say, okay, maybe this is worth investing in, maybe this is worth putting time into, maybe there's leaders who can step up and think about a new direction for how we approach transportation in our public realm. So this is a project that lasted for a day and actually became a monthly event and cost a few $1,000s. That sort of approach over time, I think, is starting to really resonate with people just culturally. We think of change being delivered not all at once in a perfect and final state with a pretty bow on it, but in versions, right? In iterations, and improvement can be constant and annual, and you get a push notification to your phone saying new update, right? Now, cities aren't so easy as just hitting the update button, but in a way, there's a methodology there that really resonates with me, and I hope it resonates with you, and that we can start with something immediately, get a prototype going quickly and inexpensively, and learn from it together and improve it where the improvements seem to be beneficial, and discarding the things that aren't beneficial. And so I really think this is a wonderful slide that my partner Tony often used, in terms of what Windows 3 was like and now what Windows 10 is like today. As professionals, a lot of us are in this webinar today, in the planning, engineering, urban design space. We would like to think that we know exactly how to design something from the outset, and I think we can usually get it, pretty close to that. But there are often times when we design for something on a computer screen and it doesn't really work with how people use space in real time. So this is a great meme that has been around the internet for a number of years, but it really sums up that we have to be a little bit more humble in how we approach design and transformation in our communities and try things that are small, because you don't want to spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to find out that something doesn't work. And this image really underscores that. So the methodology that we have developed with lots of people across the country and the globe and have come to define and include in all of our master planning and urban design work is tactical urbanism. And it's the short-term, low-cost, and scalable projects that are intended to create long-term change. And I think that intent is really what sets tactical urbanism apart from similar ideas. It's really about saying, hey, we can start with something like the cones in the street today, but we're really thinking about the vision in the long term. And this is literally just step one. This is day one. And Jaime Lerner is a great urbanist and former mayor and architect in Curitiba, Brazil. And one of the great quotes that he famously said is that to innovate is to start, right? You got to start somewhere. You got to start with something. And for a lot of us, it's just what we have on hand. And sometimes that's a cone or a traffic sign. The projects that we work on and the methodology we share and try to embed in cities is to have this iterative approach, right? And build, measure, and learn is kind of the shorthand for it. So you try something, test it again, and invest in things that work and work well. The methodology is applied, primarily in three ways. Public engagement is being key. If you're working on a demonstration project for a day, a week, that's something where very inexpensive materials are appropriate. And it's primarily about showing people that the day-to-day environment can change and engaging them in that conversation with a physical project. The second way is through more pilot or interim design projects. I'll explain those a little bit more in a few minutes, but really what do you do when you have a successful public engagement process and demand for something, but you don't have the dollars and resources, the pilots and interim design allow you to continue to test and refine, but still use a temporary toolkit so you can adjust as you go. And then finally, a lot of our work is in the last 2 or 3 years to track towards policies and programs. So helping cities set up ways to do this on their own, or without the help of consultants every time. Let's say that there's really just a muscle that's built and a mechanism that legally allows for these projects to move forward with very clear boundaries and constraints and processes, so that everyone feels like they have predictability. I'll share 3 quick examples before I pivot into the COVID-19 streets, as we're calling them, examples and what we're learning every day. Actually, as each day and week goes by, we're learning more and more. So quickly, here's a project in Asheville, North Carolina that we wrapped up about a year ago. This is a street actually that is on the edge of their downtown. The context is changing, like a lot of downtowns. There's new investment, there's new breweries, there's a demand for more walkability, there's new mixed-use buildings and condos and apartments that are coming in, and the street no longer really functions and serves the purpose of that changing context. And people are wanting to see the street become safer. And so you see here 2 lanes, some bike lanes and parking. What was interesting about this project, it was set up from the beginning to take a capital budget line item, which is to reconstruct this entire street in 2022, and try something to inform what that design should actually be. And so we partnered with the local bike advocacy organization, with downtown merchants and AARP and the city itself. And so through public engagement, we learned that people wanted to cycle safely. They wanted to also walk safely and scoot safely and drive safely. And so it became less about designing a perfect MUTCD compliant bike lane and more about just expanding the sidewalk, but making it clear that that space can be used by a wide variety of people. And so we bumped the parking out, narrowed the travel lane down, and then painted what you see there in tan, that sort of shared use path, for lack of a better term. We used planters, we used signs, we used what we call armadillos. Those are those little black and white humps in the street. And the goal was to test this for a period of 12 months and get a lot of feedback from users, and also test the safety performance of the street. And we did this over as a 6-block stretch. Like most of our projects, we create a bridge between volunteers, activists, local property owners, and city staff. And so we get everybody together out there doing it. And this required about 120 volunteers over one weekend, which was a big lift, obviously, but it was a big street, a long length. And we really wanted to make sure that as many people could touch this project, because that helps them understand it and become champions for the longer term. This was the very center of the project. This is a mural designed by a local artist. And the idea here is that new condo building that you see and the changing context, actually brings about changes to the street on a temporary basis already before we started this project. So sometimes this block would be closed to traffic for events. And so we wanted to celebrate that block. We wanted to design that block to be more like a plaza when it's closed to cars. But obviously still, 95% of the time you allow driving as you normally would. You can see the double yellow center line down the middle of the street there, on-street parking, et cetera. And so it's really meant to be for about flexible use. Allow, the street to evolve as, time of day or day of week. With all our projects, we do a lot of analysis and measuring of what's working and what's not. We partnered with the University of North Carolina, Asheville to collect a lot of this data, as well as the city. What we found is that over this stretch of the streets, the speed was reduced on average by 28%. Before the project, 2 out of 3 vehicles were speeding. We brought that down to about 1 out of 5. The highest recorded speed before the project was 89 miles an hour, which is insane. If you think about a city street with 2-lane traffic, that's obviously way too fast. Afterwards, it was 41 miles an hour. And at the end of the day, there was really no change in the number of vehicles that were driving on the street. So all of this was taking space that was hiding in plain sight and rebalancing the street to allow for a wider variety of users and uses. So I think there's a lot of lessons in terms of the geometric opportunities that we have when we rethink our streets. We partnered with a group to call it State of Place to really evaluate this quantitatively. They have an incredible algorithm that includes 200 and something variables that allow them to connect that to economic value and anticipate economic, return on investment. And what we saw was their state of play score go from a 42.3 on that street up to a 71.8. And we spent about $20,000, I think, on materials for that whole project. And the return on investment was $23.40, or what they anticipated to be an economic benefit of $3.5 million if the project was made permanent. But at the end of the day, this is why we do what we do. We obviously need a lot more spaces like this in our cities, particularly right now when we have playgrounds and parks in communities all across the country and the globe that are closed to playing. Number two, I want to underscore this point that anybody can be involved. I showed you that volunteer image from Asheville, but this is a project that very intentionally engaged students. This is obviously quite far away in Hawaii, but we were working with the school, some teachers, a local foundation in the city of Honolulu to develop two relatively important changes on intersections that were known to be unsafe. And so we worked with the students to help them understand what urban planning is, what tactical urbanism is all about, and then let them loose on designing interventions at these two primary intersections where there's a lot of crashes and students feel threatened and unsafe as they walk to and from school on a daily basis. So there you can see the students digging in. These are just some of the designs that they came up with in terms of adding high visibility crosswalks, some murals, curb extensions, the kind of the kit parts that many on this webinar are obviously very familiar with. But they really developed an artfulness to the work, and the intent here was to take what they all would vote on as one of the best designs and what we could see as the most realistic in terms of the timeline that we had to deliver it. And this became the winning submission. So literally taking a sketch like this from students one day and within a few weeks, translating that into working implementation drawings and explaining exactly how this would be laid out with students and by the city and how that partnership would flow. And then a few months later, here's that project underway. So you see some of the students and volunteers painting. It's actually right in front of the high school there. And then the end result. This is just some quick before and afters. Adding more curb extensions, shortening the crossings, making pedestrians more visible. Obviously adding some art and beauty to the street. There are students there enjoying the new intervention. So really, we need to be engaged with professionals as city leaders, as consultants, as advocates who know a lot of the details of these things, but including people in the physical delivery is 100% possible. And I would argue is really critically important for building buy-in and political will for these kinds of changes longer term. And finally, you can't scale what you don't permit. And so this work is really hard to get buy-in from with, police chiefs, as Jim was saying earlier, with engineers, with city staff, with neighbors, with business owners. Like, there's a lot of barriers to doing this work as impactful and as simple and low cost as it can be. And so, like I mentioned, we've been developing more of these programmatic responses to allow communities to say yes when they're so used to saying no. And this goes back, to our first project in that vein, which was in Burlington, Vermont. We were engaged with leading a bike and pedestrian master plan with the city and with a firm called DuBois and King. And we were just starting that project when a parent decided to propose a one-day pop-up bike lane so her kids could get to and from school safely. And the city looked at that and said, hey, great idea. We have this master plan coming. We want to be implementing protected bike lanes as a result of the plan, but we have no way to say yes. So we have to say no. And that's really unfortunate when you have positive energy and people who want to contribute and ideas that the city generally supports, and you don't have a way forward. So what spun out of that very emphatic no was a very emphatic yes, that we want to actually permit these things, and here are the parameters under which you can do it. And so we authored this demonstration project policy and guide for the city to basically give them permission to let citizens and advocates try these things out for a period of 1 to 7 days. At that time, we'd never written a policy like this, so we actually wanted to test our own work. And so we used that opportunity as an engagement for the larger master plan. And during a very busy weekend in Burlington, where they have a large art event and it also open streets where they closed down some streets to traffic on 2 different neighborhoods, we said, that's a perfect time to engage people when they're already out And so we tried things like curb extensions, which were very cheap and cheerful, just a way to kind of test that policy and respond to the demands of this event. For example, this is an art event that attracts 10,000 people over one weekend, and they all get crammed onto a 5-foot sidewalk. So the idea was to create like a release valve in a few places that you see there for people to enjoy the space. We tested out a number of protected bike lanes using a variety of materials. This was to get people from the core of the downtown into the neighborhood where Open Streets was happening on the one Sunday that week. They closed down again about 2.5 miles of streets. And we brought out a lot of folks in the city to try some things out with the design, right? With the protected bike lanes. We were narrowing streets. We were really trying to ensure that operationally people were comfortable with some of these ideas because we were going to include them in recommendations in the master plan itself. You know, fast forward a year from that demonstration project, almost exactly a year, and there's Peggy O'Neill, the mother who originally proposed the protected bike lanes, and now she's got this policy and this process that the city had adopted to do that. And so she was featured in NPR as being this super advocate for getting the community to move on that. And the city moved on quickly. And before we were even done with the master plan, they developed a pilot project process. And here you see them testing those two different elements in the street. We had a 4-lane street, they brought it down to 2 lanes and tested it for 1 year. And you can see those armadillos and then the typical delineators as a way to see what people preferred, both driving and cycling. And then finally, to make that master plan real, to come to fruition, we know that Burlington, like most New England cities, doesn't have millions of dollars lying around to invest in permanent infrastructure. So we developed for them these design and material standards for what we call quick build projects, which are intended to last from say 1 year to 5 years, and to give them the kind of permission to go out and do that work and have it be adjustable, right? I mean, this is, in Burlington, they get a ton of snow like Maine does typically, and they want to try things out like, how are we going to plow these protected bike lanes? How are we going to sweep them? And how are we going to manage the materials? What's the replacement cost going to be? And so getting them in the ground is a way to actually test all those things and build up an awareness and the faculties of the people who are operating the plow, so they understand how to do that and learn from it over time. And so it allows for those adjustments to be made. So this is just some snapshots of one of the projects that was a priority for the city coming out of the master plan, which is what's called a neighborhood greenway. I will explain this also as a neighborhood slow street, which is how you really try to reduce through traffic and make the streets, the speeds low enough that people can just share them equitably, as you can see there, the people on skateboards and walking and cycling. So we do this work because, if you read a book, you might retain 10% of that. If you listen to me jabber on, you might take away, 20% of what I say today. But if we all went out and did something together, which is, I know, the typical Build Maine fashion, we would really take something more concrete away from that experience. And so a lot of our work is primarily about giving communities that experience of change, delivering it together, and learning and seeing how we can build that muscle so that communities can rely on this when change needs to happen quickly. And I'll get to that in a second. But to Jim's earlier coffee conversation with many of you, I want to underscore that this is obviously not entirely new in Maine, that many people have been engaged in advocating for this work and delivering it, which is really, really exciting to see. 5 years ago, this was not the case. And I think this was really thought of as a sort of alien, odd approach to thinking about traffic safety and who can be involved in delivering projects. And I just want to commend all of you who've been moving this forward, piece by piece with many partners across the state. So keep up that great work. So let's pivot to COVID-19. No one really saw this coming, obviously, and no one was prepared for the impact I think this would have and the longevity that this would have over not just days and weeks, but months and possibly years. And so we've been in this position of needing to really rethink how transportation works, who is a priority in terms of moving them safely, responding to things like a lot less traffic, but a lot higher speeds. The fact that many neighborhoods are impacted by this in disparate ways, depending on their roles. Now, Maine has obviously been spared from the worst of the pandemic so far when compared to states and cities across the country. Unfortunately, where I live in New York City, that has not been the case. It's been an extremely challenging time for the city, but it's also been a hopeful time. I think a lot of people are seeing that as much of a disaster as this has been, that there is a bright light at the end of the tunnel, which is maybe a more sustainable city, less air pollution, safer streets, more cohesive neighborhoods. And those are things that will make the next pandemic or the next disaster, we'll be more prepared for that. We'll be more resilient as a city. And I think as we've seen over, many hundreds of years, New York is a resilient place. And I hope we become even more so after we get through this together. So we've really seen the tactical urbanism methodology become the de facto way that cities are managing this from a public works perspective, from a street design, mobility perspective, and managing public spaces. And I think as cities now pivot towards recovery, this becomes a really critical toolkit in being able to help businesses get back on their feet, help us get out of doors and outside together in the warm summer months, to feel connected again and to do that safely. So this is the typical methodology that we lay out from the demonstration and the pilot, interim design, and long-term investment. That's really now pivoted to more something like this, which is 3 months. What can we do right now? What materials do we have on hand? Is it cones? Is it barrels? Is it just signs that we put on barricades in the middle of the street to try and alter the way that our streets operate, to manage some of the challenges that have emerged in several months that have passed. As the economy and our policies and our government leaders pivot us more towards recovery, which is happening now. This is happening slowly and unevenly from county to county, state to state, nation to nation. But we're seeing that there's an opportunity to take the next step with some of these temporary changes and to start to consider and evaluate how what gets done this summer can inform longer term changes in our communities that might be beneficial for a broad spectrum of our society. And for that, right now in Maine, I think it's about both mobility, but it's also about place, and it's about business and local businesses and being able to give them space in our public realm to be able to serve us safely and to ideally make a go of that economically. So there's been 2 initial responses to this across the country and even the globe. Some cities right off the bat took a more limiting approach to managing things like trails and parks and public spaces, playgrounds, and completely shut them down. You can see here an example in Chicago where one of the most popular trails was closed. And that was obviously very frustrating for people who are cooped up indoors, live in city apartments, don't have access to maybe huge amounts of public space. And so when you find a trail, that's a place where you can get out and walk and bike and exercise and breathe air that's fresh. And that's something they decide not to allow, whereas a city like Denver moved really quickly, and many others, to open the streets and say, look, the only way we're gonna be able to manage this and do this equitably is to bring the streets into play here as shared spaces, meaning you have to slow down the cars and indicate that people need to share those spaces safely and allow people to get out and do that in a way that's really not been common in a United States context. It's something that happens a lot in European cities, but it's not been very common here in the US. So those are kind of the 2 ways that cities responded. Many cities have responded one way and then pivoted towards the other. Towards the end of March, I started to see that this was going to be a trend, that many cities were going to start adopting these tactics. And we built this typology just through observation and research. And so we started keeping track of what cities were doing what and where, and how big or how small their interventions were. And effectively, it comes down to these 6 types. There's variations on the theme, but we created these little vignettes to kind of describe them quickly. Open streets was really one of the quick responses. That's now pivoted towards what we call streeteries, altering the curb lane, sharing the streets, like I just mentioned, temporary bike lanes, and then even the smallest change, like allowing people not to have to push the button to cross the street, that pedestrian signal would just be on what's called recall, so that no matter what, you would get that walk sign at the intersection, really trying to, down to that small level of hundreds of people a day pressing a button and reducing the need for that. So there, we'll just dig in a little bit further with open streets. Obviously, this is something that has been happening in communities for decades. I know that Portland does this on a portion of Baxter Boulevard, and other communities do this around New England, as I mentioned, like in Burlington. This was a response that primarily focused on parks and roads that were in parks or along waterfronts, which is depicted here. These are streets that are relatively easy to close. They usually don't serve a big transportation purpose. They have few, if any, intersections, and they're already within public spaces, which we're seeing a surge of demand as the weather warmed this spring. And so that was really one of the first responses, and dozens of cities started to do this, but then started to realize that the people who live near and can access parks, generally in communities, tend to be wealthier and have that benefit close by, whereas communities that really needed the benefit were those that lacked open space. I'll get to that later. Ignore the title there. I should have changed the title. But open streets then pivoted more towards commercial districts, and now we've seen in the last 3 weeks dozens of cities start to either repurpose the curb lane for dining and retailing, or take the whole street. And sometimes this is for a certain time of day. Sometimes it's all at once. And sometimes it's just limited to 1 day per week. So there's a lot of flexibility built into that, but communities are trying this to see how they can support merchants, as I mentioned earlier. Open curbs is maybe the most flexible approach. Sometimes it's used for queuing to get in and out of essential businesses. Sometimes it's used for just wider operational space for walking or biking and scooting where there's narrow sidewalks, particularly in commercial districts. But also we're seeing this in residential context as well. Many neighborhoods have very narrow sidewalks where passing somebody right now has been very kind of nerve-wracking for those who are concerned about contact and what that means. I think as the science and our understanding of transmission has advanced, this is a little bit less of a concern, but the need is still there largely for, I think, the walking space generally, and obviously for dining and retail. Shared streets I mentioned, these are really interesting from the standpoint that they require as little as a cone and a sign. And it's amazing to have seen across the country the psychological impact this has had in residential neighborhoods. That from 2 months ago, people could never have imagined, comfortably walking in the middle of the street with their 8-year-old, and all of a sudden a sign and a cone mentally creates this change of environment, limits the traffic to just those who essentially need to be on the block, and creates a space that we can take over and share equitably between motor vehicle users and still allow emergency vehicles, still allow deliveries. You can still park in your driveway. That's not an issue, but we're going to try to limit that through traffic. And this has worked incredibly, maybe surprisingly well in North American cities. Temporary bikeways are pretty self-explanatory. We've seen those both in the curb lane, but also seeing bike lanes that were existing, maybe they were narrow, being widened or upgraded, being protected. Many cities are taking those on, and as I mentioned, the signal recall. So in summary, we've seen more than 225 cities across the globe take on one or more of these measures. Increasingly, cities are doing multiple measures. It's kind of amazing that it boils down to really 6 moves so far, 6 tactics, as we say. There's really a lot of guidance and practice you can draw upon. It's already in NACDO street design guidance, in local city and regional guides, in MUTCD, that we can just leverage and repurpose for the moment. So for a lot of communities, this may not be entirely new. It's just rethinking and reapplying tools that existed before the pandemic and having a whole new reason to make these types of changes. So this changes daily. I can't keep up with the number of cities at this point. I'm doing my best through a spreadsheet, which I'll link at the end of this. But I'll just say, look at this graph in terms of scale. And I want to share this with you, understanding that communities in Maine are small. Our biggest city is about 70,000 people in Portland. So it's really important to right size the measure and the response to the scale of the community and the challenge that you're facing. But for context, cities and regions like Paris, they're doing more than 400 miles of temporary bikeways to start, and then upgrading those to make them permanent. Montreal is doing sidewalk extensions, bikeways, slow streets in neighborhood context, open streets along commercial districts to support movement and merchants. And they're doing a whole range of things, which is really amazing. If anyone has a chance to get up to Montreal this summer, it would be an amazing case study to see what they're going to be pulling off. And they're doing, more than 130 miles of that around the city. On down to smaller communities like Pasadena, they literally set up 100 miles of slow streets almost overnight with just putting up signs around the community. And what's also interesting to me is that more and more we're seeing this applied in small cities. And I've highlighted here in yellow the communities across New England. that are of a population less than 100,000 who are active in this right now. So you can see some peers from wherever you live and work and advocate on this list. And so I encourage you to reach out if you haven't already, to learn about what these cities are doing and how that might apply to a city in town of 500 people, 5,000, up to 50,000, right? There is really a way for cities to do this at all scales. In fact, I want to underscore that it's far easier to do this in a Belfast, Maine, than it is to do this in New York City. The bureaucracy and the permission needed, the creativity that's already embedded in these communities, you can just tap that. And it can usually happen within a week, within one council vote, and it doesn't take as big a lift as it does in a much larger city like New York, where we went weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks without seeing any response, and are finally starting to see the city move on this. So just want to give a shout out to New England, that of all these cities that we're documenting of populations under 100,000, about a third of them are based in New England. So that's great. Let's hope to see a lot more of that this summer. And I think I want to end this today with some lessons that are emerging and what we've learned to date from all around the globe, and of course across New England. As with anything, political leadership matters most. Where we've seen people act is where there's been a strong leadership or alignment in city councils. It's where there's been a mayor who's been pushing for this to happen and taking the leadership reins and seeing both the short-term need in the response, but also the opportunity in the recovery to put back a city that's better than it was before the pandemic, and to be prepared for the next one. There's this quote from Governor Janet Mills which I read last night that said, "Look, let's take a look at this stuff. Let's look at our downtowns. Let's be creative. Let's think about our local businesses and how we get them up and running." And within that, I think there's a lot of license for creativity. And I know that the DOT has been partnering with Rockland and will partner with others to see what can be done to support your local communities as the economy comes back. If you have a plan, if you have a policy, if you've done something relatively recently that says X change could happen on Y street, this is the time to open that plan and take that seriously and see how you can reverse engineer it from maybe a more permanent state to a temporary state. The lesson here is, I think Oakland, California is one of the first cities to really do that in a one-to-one way. So they have a neighborhood slow streets plan as part of their bike master plan, which called for 74 miles of changes to calm traffic on streets and make them more community-oriented spaces. They basically took that plan, which was adopted 18 months ago. They looked at the need in their neighborhoods with the pandemic, and they said, geez, we can do this. And this is the bare minimum that we can do it with, and we just need to get started. And we'll explain to people, as we go, what this is all about, and get feedback and iterate and make changes. And we can remove some, we can add some, we can add more, signs if needed, et cetera. But like just starting it and letting it go from there, which has been a great lesson. There we go.
Okay.
Creating open streets and parks, like I said, it was the first, kind of initial response. Exeter, New Hampshire did that along Swayze Parkway near their downtown along the river. So just closing that segment of street to give people more space to move and to recreate. 4, I think this is really critical. I hope if you take anything away from this 45-minute presentation, it's that, don't overcomplicate things, and you can apply things that already exist in manuals, in highway guidance, in DOT language, but repurpose it for the needs of now. And for that, I would look towards roadway construction, processes and protocols and materials. Look at how you do festivals on your streets, in the summer. Look at road races, how you manage traffic, how you divert traffic, if need be. How do you, reduce lanes or capacity and sign that? These are all things that you can do, but obviously remix it for the needs of this summer and moving people safely around our communities. And I think that's a really important lesson I want you to take away, is that this is not, we're not requiring the invention of new things, just trying to give you a permission slip to think a little bit differently about the materials and things that you already do routinely, but part of things that are already accepted and adopted in the community, typically on a seasonal basis. So the toolkit, at least to start, is very basic. It's cones, it's signs. Sometimes they don't even have to be metal signs. It can be printed on coroplast or even paper. I can tell you here in New York City, where we have a very, robust DOT, they've put out, these wooden barricades that the police uses for special events. And they put these little 8.5 by 11 yellow paper signs that say, you know, go slow and share the street. And that's it. No MUTCD, no nothing. It's just wooden barricades, a printed paper sign that's slipped into, you know, a plastic cover so it doesn't get wet, and that's it. So it can be really simple, and I want you to think about this as like something that's light and quick and cheap, and don't emphasize that it has to be this perfectly designed thing from the get-go. As I mentioned, small cities are as capable as any to act. So back to Burlington. Burlington has temporary measures on 25% of their street network. So that's the largest that I know of across the entire globe. Some of those measures are a little bit more, include a little more infrastructure, like you see with the signs above there in terms of shared streets and neighborhood level. Some of those are just designating corridors as being safe corridors so that motorists are made to be much more aware that people might be biking more, walking more in the street along their more major arterials, and to take those streets into consideration and drive safely. But in any event, that's a really impressive thing that a city of 40,000 people has done that is at the scale it's doing it for its context, you know, leading the globe. Evaluation street or on the sidewalk may not work perfectly. So be open to that, take feedback, and, you know, go out there once a day at first, go out there once a week after a few weeks, and just make sure things are going okay, and then make changes as you need to. If it becomes too much to manage, then it might be a good indicator that if otherwise it's having a good positive response, to think about maybe a slightly more permanent material. So getting more into that interim toolkit with the delineators and armadillos and things that are a little bit more fixed, so they don't have quite the same maintenance need. The behavior that people were concerned about in many cities about people treating a closed block like a festival, like we're going to be out there barbecuing and getting too close together and transmitting the disease. So far, we've really not seen that behavior materialize anywhere in the globe. People understand intuitively this is a different time. We all want to self-preserve our own health. And so people are acting, from what we've seen, very responsibly in these new spaces that are created. On the lower right there, that is a picture of my son who's learning to ride his bike. We have an open street, a few open streets near our apartment. And I can tell you, with closed playgrounds and closed, you know, some parks that are closed, this has been an extremely valuable release valve for us as a family and for him to get out and move. And if that image makes you scared, then, well, I should say, I hope that image does not make you scared, because this is the kind of reality that we're seeing now in our streets in New York and in many communities, and that this is the activity that's actually happening, and this is who we're serving when we open our streets for a broader, you know, number of users. Most cities lack that protocol, though, to respond, and so the cities that have had policies or measures in place or know how to do this can rely on that muscle. And I just want to call out Burlington again. You know, they move very quickly relative to other cities in North America. I would like to think that's partially because of the work they've done in the past to understand the approach, understand the materials, understand what the you know, the concerns might be, and have the communication mechanisms ready to talk to neighborhoods and to talk and work with advocacy groups to help them monitor, you know, help install and manage what's, you know, a really quite impressive change to their streets, as I called out. I think there are a lot of communities, there's been missed opportunities, not focusing enough on equity, or just looking at the data, understanding where the need is greatest and acting there first. That's a really important thing to think about. Providence, Rhode Island did that in a great way. They mapped, you can see there on the left, they mapped where people live and have the least access to open space, both in back and front yards and also park space. And they put in 13 miles of shared slow streets directly through the heart of those neighborhoods that need access to the open space the most. So that's really taking an equity lens on this and making sure that people who don't have access easily get that access as needed. Scale the response to the need, right? So in smaller towns, you may not have to do miles. You may not even have to do 10 blocks. You might be doing a couple blocks, might be doing a curbside pickup drop-off zone. You might be doing, you know, experimenting with tables and chairs to allow the local coffee shop to open and have, you know, ability to serve more people, to get them up and running. You know, just be flexible and adapt. You know, I know Rockland, Maine actually got international attention for closing Main Street. I read last night that it's maybe not as aggressive as they initially planned for, that they're going to be doing this over, I guess, a couple weekends instead, rather than the kind of full committal for the month of June, which was initially proposed. And I think that's okay. You know, like literally that's going to be something that everyone learns from and can observe and experience. And then if it works well, you can imagine Rockland does that more for a longer term basis starting in July. If it doesn't go well, then you try something else or you pivot back. Again, there's flexibility built into this process and this methodology, and that's a real strength at this time when we don't know how things are going to change week to week and how people and businesses are going to respond. And then finally, cities are really extending their initiatives, those who have started on this a couple months ago. So I wouldn't be surprised as you all learn collectively in the state and learn from others across New England and the country and the globe that you might start some things and continue to evolve that as we pivot towards this new normal. And if the end result is a downtown street or a neighborhood where people drive slower, where businesses have more foot traffic, where we feel safer together in the public realm, that is one of the better outcomes that I could see happening as it relates to planning and design of our communities. So for more information, we've worked really quickly and really hard on a set of guidance that we've been delivering with NACDO at the national, actually the international level. So we released this guide last week where we go through things like the policies to consider at different stages of lockdown versus reopening and the kinds of things you can start to consider. We've put together these cut sheets, which are meant to be, high level guidance and basically a permission slip to go out and try some of these things in your communities. And I'm obviously not going to read through all these, but we released 6 cut sheets last Thursday, and these are available for download on the NACDO website. They have a whole section dedicated to the pandemic response, and we'll be releasing another tranche in about 2 or 3 weeks' time, which will be maybe, I think it's 8 more measures that will be coming out. So there's emerging guidance. NACDO is a collection of city transportation officials from across the country, both large and small, that think about these things, think about things like liability, and they think about concerns around materials and maintenance and durability. And so this has been vetted and quickly, obviously, but is put out there as best practices for what we know to date. So I encourage you to visit the NACDO website and download this work, and just know that we're going to be adding to this in the coming weeks. Finally, I will share this PDF so you guys have access to it later for all the information that's included that I've gone through relatively quickly. But this link will allow you access to our spreadsheet. We have that organized into the 6 typologies and all the cities across the globe that are engaging in this. I would love it if people in Maine can stay on top of what communities are doing. I know that Damascata is considering this, that Belfast just acted, that Bangor might be moving forward on something. I've heard these things from colleagues and friends and family. So please feel free to add to this. Once you click on this link, I'll give you access, and then you can update it as things change and emerge. So we have a lot of resources for you. You can go to tacticalurbanismguide.com, download these things, go to nacdo.org, find that emerging guidance that we've created with them, and I think we will now have a conversation. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. That was fantastic. I know there's a lot of questions and we're going to get right to those, but before we do, I'd just like to remind everyone to please sign up for professional development credits if you need them. I'm putting the link in the chat right now, along with the link to the NACDO guidance that Mike just mentioned. We're also going to be sending a follow-up email to everybody, so be on the lookout. This should have a variety of resources about today's talk. So we wanted to also just mention that next week we will have Sharon Woods presenting. Sharon will be talking about the variety of housing types that are missing from Maine communities, how to understand those housing types and who wants them, and how important it is to be, build more variety if we want to attract more people to our communities. So we'd like everybody to please attend that event, and please get your family, friends, and people you think should be hearing these discussions online. So I'll hand it over to Kara to talk about Q&A. Thanks again.
Great.
Yeah, we got a number of really great questions and comments. One I'll just mention first off from Patty Steinschneider. Is he thought it was important to point out how generous Mike and his crew have been with the tactics, tools, and methods that they've been developing. Most of them are online and open source, so that people can benefit from that learned knowledge. And it's just a really incredible amount of information that Street Plans has made available. So a general thank you for that. And getting into the question, so Abigail Smallwood asked, do you have any tips on how to engage a lot of volunteers while maintaining social distancing?
Yeah, and I want to say apology to Kara, because I was supposed to allow you to ask a bunch of questions that you want to get out of the presentation, and then I was supposed to read those quickly and then make sure my material in the presentation was responding. And I completely forgot to do that. So Kara, I'm sorry. But I know you all have good questions here, so I hope I answered some of them anyways at the outset here. But in terms of volunteers, yeah, this is something that we have to figure out in the coming weeks and months. Obviously, a lot of our work is oriented towards summertime and fall installation. And to do that safely is going to vary, I think, depending on where each individual community, county, state is, since we work across states and that there's a wide variety. In some instances, we may not be installing our projects this summer and fall with volunteers, or we might be organizing them into activities or things that can be done with space between folks. As you know, those of you who have implemented these projects, that can be tricky. So I think some of the things that we can do individually is, you know, you can go out and you can plant, you can plant things as an individual in a temporary planter. You know, you can set up cones as an individual. That doesn't require, you know, sets of hands. You can install signs, you know, with physical distancing. The things you can't do that easily is measure and mark on the street. I mean, at least the way that we go about installing our projects requires typically a couple hands on the asphalt close together. You know, laying down traffic tape, which is a very common material that we use, you know, takes a couple hands to roll it and cut it. So maybe it's something like you have to pre-cut strips and then one at a time go out into the street and do that. So it's a really good question. It's one we haven't entirely figured out because we haven't done an install project yet, but we're looking at all these different options on how we continue to be able to work with volunteers in any way possible, because as you all see here, that's one of the big values of this work is we get to engage people in a very, you know, hands-on tactical way. And, you know, you have to think through just like the steps to implementation and how some of those can be reverse engineered to allow for more individual work, but collectively doing it to make the project happen. And it might wind up lengthening your, you know, maybe it's instead of 1 day, maybe it becomes 3 days to do it. So it's just things to consider.
Another question from Abigail. She says she loves the paint applications, but it's been difficult to get officials to accept that they are allowable within MUTCD. Can you just talk a little bit more about paint and colored paint and where, you know, within a street it's acceptable to use paint or not?
Sure. I mean, it's acceptable wherever your local engineering, you know, public works department and DOT, if it's a state road, is willing to accept it. You know, we've had communities that adhere to MUTCD very closely, which often means very muted color tones as the color palette. Oftentimes that means not doing crosswalks, not doing anything that is construed as traffic control like a crosswalk, but instead focusing on the intersection between the crosswalk, like the center of the intersection, or curb extensions. Curb extensions are oftentimes probably the easiest thing to get permitted because they're not a traffic control device, they're not driven over, and it's easier to get the artwork and the color, the better, you know, broader, bolder color palettes in those types of spaces. So if you are facing resistance locally, you know, you can pivot, or you can try to make sure your color palette is muted. Usually that's, you know, reds and browns and, you know, darker tans and things like that. At the end of the day, your local engineer has to be comfortable with what you wind up, you know, designing and moving forward with, and that the latitude there is vast. And a lot of communities have engineers and staff that want to experiment with this stuff and go for it, and, you know, document the process clearly and say this is why we're doing it and here's a justification for it. Others are going to, you know, adhere to a book, the book or of MUTCD or other guidance, which, you know, was written largely before this stuff was being practiced and used across the country and the globe. So, you know, there's a little bit of a gap in the practice versus the guidance. That's clear. We have written a guide which you can access at our tacticalurbanismguide.com website called the Asphalt Art Guide, and where we talk a lot more about those kinds of issues, and you can dig into the details there, and hopefully that would be useful for you. So we've had to deal with that in a variety of ways with cities across the country. In terms of the paint, I think was also a sub-question, right? Obviously, if it's in a space where it's being driven over, and obviously if it's in an environment like Maine where there's a lot of sand and salt that might be used in any given winter, that paint will deteriorate, and you need to expect that going into the process. Less so, again, if it's going to be in a space that people bike over or they walk over, and that's primarily the user group. The maintenance and the longevity is much longer, usually 2, 3, 4, even 5 years time, if it's just in the walking space. So you can plan and budget for either we're gonna do this for 1 year, see how long it lasts, maybe it fades and we don't do it again, or like many communities do, it becomes an opportunity to re-engage people every spring to go out and maybe try a new design, try new colors. Maybe the city over time gets more comfortable with the color palette, and you can expand and engage local artists and bring the talents of your neighborhood out into the street, which is one of those great benefits. So there's definitely ways to think about it, but I think be clear-eyed about it. And I think Mike made a comment here too about just some of those expectations need to be set clearly up front on how long it's going to last, depending on where you apply it.
Great. I guess another question I imagine is in some people's minds, especially municipal staff, is how they can help make these kinds of projects happen when they're already so busy managing, the pressing needs related to the pandemic, and what you're seeing from communities that have less staff capacity to begin with.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's really important to recognize that a lot of cities that are doing, if they can do anything, they're doing what they can, right, with the resources that they have. And it's really challenging when the guidance is changing weekly, the concerns in the city are changing. Some cities are being hit harder than others. So we definitely want to recognize that first and foremost. But where we see capacity added is that a number of projects that staff are working on have been put on hold, both longer range planning and design projects, and instead staff time being pivoted towards more immediate response. And all the better if there is a plan or policy that you can point to that gives you some guidance or priorities on where you might act. Another key way that cities are acting is they're literally just trusting citizens to be a part of this. And again, where we see cities who have acted, I think some of the first movers were those places where there was a bond and a trust between advocates and, say, business owners and residents and city staff. If that has been built over years and there's a working relationship of partnerships and people understand we're kind of in this together, we need to do this together, then that can be a really great benefit to say, hey, we're public works and we've got a crew of 5 or 10 people and we can put out the cones and the signs. We literally cannot monitor these. We can't manage this. We need partners on the ground. And finding out who the neighborhood association is, who the business owner is, who can adopt the intersection or adopt the corner, really work together as a community to make sure these things are working well and safely for everybody, is something that's a bit of a leap in a lot of places. But in places that have that trust or those relationships built, like a Burlington, Vermont, it's really not that difficult, and that level of trust has been established. A lot of communities do not have that, though, which makes this difficult to rely upon during the pandemic if staff time is so challenged or reduced. So that's a couple tips and insights on how cities are doing it. It literally just takes leadership and trust.
And I guess a little bit of a follow-up, digging into that a little bit more, is are you seeing municipalities taking things so far and then the business community or local residents sort of backfilling what happens in the space, thinking especially about restaurants and retailers and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a little too early for that, I think. A number of cities have made announcements. Only a couple cities that we know of are fully open for dining in the street, whether that's the parking lane, the curb lane, or it's in the travel way itself. So what I'm anticipating is the communities that are committing to this for the next 2, 3, 4 months, I think you're going to see exactly that. I think you're going to see maybe the barricades, the traffic stuff come out to demarcate the space. And I think the opportunity is going to be to then pivot away from that traffic control material to something that's more beautiful, right? As businesses reopen, as cash flow starts again, you might start to see planters put in the street. You might see some of that, temporary paint installed on the asphalt. You might see more umbrellas, tables and chairs, things that are really communicating that the space use is changing and has changed. Right now, I think it's really just about delineating it. And I think you're going to see a lot of creative responses that come from business owners in the coming weeks and months. So it's a great question. We don't know yet, but I think that's what's coming around the corner.
Right. And again, a little bit on that same vein of retail and business, and because that seems to be the focus of a lot of conversation right now in Maine, is what have you learned from seeing what's happened in other communities about policies that have been put in place by municipalities trying to create opportunities for the space that haven't really fully worked because fees are too high or design requirements are too great. Have you kind of been able to observe that a little bit?
Again, it's early, but there's a really kind of narrow path, I think, for communities, and every community is different. The economics of your restaurants and retailers is a little bit different, even on the same block, in terms of what their needs are. So I think first and foremost, you have to listen and find a way to convene, or if you haven't already done that, and hear out what all these concerns are and what the desires are. And it's basically trying to thread that needle to provide a response that is equitable, right? So you think about, main streets, that tends to be where the real estate value is a little bit higher than the side streets. So what if you're a business on the side street, but you really have this need to open up the curb lane to get 3 tables and chairs out there? If your, say your little cafe only has 5 tables indoors, that really will make a difference. The economics of what makes sense is, I think, a key driver of this for merchants, and particularly for restaurants. If you have only those 5 tables inside and you're only allowed 20% or say 25% capacity at the opening of, as things start to relax in terms of restrictions, that's probably not enough for you to make a go of it, which means you may not open. The longer you don't reopen, the less sales tax the city is collecting, and the less likely that business will reopen. And then you might have weeks and months of years of, vacant spaces. So there's really kind of this slippery slope that I think cities need to be concerned about, and really listen to merchants and think about, now is not really the time to set forth, a weeks-long process and hundreds or thousands of dollars, permits fees, or paying the parking meters. So all that stuff has to be paused for, let's say, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it may be. Set your, some sunset limits on that where it'll be reevaluated, but allow people as they can physically and safely to use that space and use it productively in the public right of way for the business use. And I think we can all see the greater public good of that, even though historically there's been some conflicts about private businesses using public space. There's clearly a public good that's going to be generated in the mid to long term by removing the red tape and the barriers for businesses to do this at this time. And again, I would just underscore, be clear and consistent with how you're messaging, what is this for, who is it for, and how long it will last, and then evaluate, and then adapt as you need to.
Great. Thank you. Carol Ironman asked a question, which, I think this may be a little local for Mike, but she's interested in knowing if any, state DOTs in general, sorry. So you can respond to this, have taken a lead on these projects, or are they mostly locally driven?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, the example in Maine that I know of is Rockland has worked close to the DOT. I mean, Main Street is a state road, so there's been collaboration there that I think has been productive. And I'm just trying to think, going through my spreadsheet in my brain, like what other state road examples that there are. Sure, there are many. Nothing pops to mind immediately, but you can certainly access our spreadsheet, and there's probably some notes in there that indicate that. But I think, again, we've seen a lot of relaxing of general standards and rules as it relates to the use of our roadways and engineering guidance and standards for the economic imperative and the safety imperative of getting people out into space safely. So I think if ever DOTs are going to be open to rethinking some of the use of their right-of-ways, it's now. And again, I think we're seeing that in Maine, which is very encouraging.
And Vanessa has a similar question, but from the other end. How common is it for Town Hall to take up the lead, or are most waiting for their various committees and local organizations to push the idea up?
It's a mix. I think where there's really strong leadership and communities that are, let's say, high on the curve of rethinking their streets prior to the pandemic, there's been staff leadership or political directives from mayors, et cetera, to say, hey, we can go do this and let's leverage this plan. There's been a lot of communities that have done that. But I'd say a good 50% of cities are doing it only because they're being compelled to act by merchants, by businesses, by advocacy organizations, by chambers of commerce, to move on some of these things. And I think that's pretty normal. And some communities have taken that advocacy and they've been really resistant and dug their heels in, but many have evolved their position. So let's go back to the beginning of my presentation with Chicago. They were refusing to do anything in the streets and right away. They were refusing to do it on a number of reasons that I think were grounded in some pretty strong principles, but in reality, it was not servicing the needs of their community as this has drawn on. And so they now have started a slow streets program, and they're distributing the slow streets program, the goal is intent, around the city equally, and focusing on neighborhoods that need it the most. So you've seen communities like say no to this kind of idea, and then realize as we've gone on months that people have been pent up. It's now summer, and people need exercise for mental health. We need to get our businesses operational, if at all possible, when it's safe to do so. So that's happening. And like anywhere, advocacy is a critical piece to that.
There are a few responses. Jim Tassi mentioned that he hasn't seen final guidance, but Maine DOT was moving toward permitting artistic elements between the keys of crosswalks for painting projects, which is great. And then Ann Ball responded that Main Street and affiliate communities they're often working with their municipalities and downtown businesses to advance some of these projects.
Yeah, again, that's a great point. And I mean, this takes a village, right, to get it done. I mean, particularly where staff capacity is already low and that may be even further reduced or strained. So, partnerships are key to all of this to make it work.
And then Owen asked, do closed streets also tend to provide a needed incentive during this pandemic for vehicle owners to stay home and not drive, especially in an urban or downtown setting?
Can you repeat the first part of that? I think I missed the first.
Are closed streets tending to provide a needed incentive during this pandemic for vehicle owners to stay home and not drive?
I think the reason for not driving is primarily driven by not going to work. I think that's been one of the key changes that we've seen around peak hour travel. And of course, just taking less trips or combining trips. I think a lot of families are saying, hey, I used to go to the grocery store 3 times a week, pick up what I need. Maybe I'm consolidating that into once every 7 or 10 or 14 days and making bigger trips. So what that results in is less driving. So I think there's some behavioral changes that might indicate ways people may shift a little bit moving forward to just not hopping in the car for every little thing at every single moment at a whim, but may think through a little bit more about how and when and get maybe into a habit of combining and chaining some of these trips so that there's not as much driving. Obviously, closing streets through traffic on residential streets still allows people who live on the block to drive. It just discourages cut through and other travel at a time, which quite frankly, the traffic levels are down anywhere from 30 to 70%, depending on where you are, and they're starting to tick back up as economies open. So it will be important for communities to evaluate as traffic levels rise, what that starts to do for some of these slowed and shared streets. If it becomes tipped too far in the other way, that there's more vehicles on the street than is comfortable to share, then you might see some of these programs have to pivot or change or be more hardline in terms of infrastructure to maintain that environment, which I think a lot of people who live on these blocks are going to want to maintain, because it's quite pleasant not to have as much traffic in your front, your front yard, so to speak, and just to be able to commune with neighbors in the street is lovely for the long term. So I think people are learning that.
Great. We're kind of, I think, running to the end of a lot of our posted questions, but I see people on the line from Ellsworth, Augusta, Portland, Westbrook. There's a number of other towns and town officials on here too, and I'd open it to people to unmute themselves and follow up on any burning questions you still have as you're thinking about your own main streets, your own neighborhoods. If you've got other questions, thoughts.
Yeah, or barriers. What are your barriers? I mean, I think that's something that we're really keen on learning from. Is it's different, a little different in every place that you go, and every city's dealing with this in their own way with their existing mechanisms. So, if you've got things, I may not have a solution for you, but I would love to hear what challenges you have.
While people are thinking, I'll just chime in.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
This is Dave Gogel from Rockland. I just wanted to, I have just a barrier that we're dealing with. I mean, you kind of mentioned we pulled back a little bit. It was not about the idea. It was more how many businesses were actually going to be open on June 1st, right? So as I'm talking to restaurants and merchants, many of them are concerned about safety of opening up, both the health of their customers and their employees. So it had a lot to do with, if we shut down Main Street on June 1, but if we only have a small handful of restaurants that are even open for dining, or alone who are ready to partake in something like this, that was the reason why we delayed to the end of the month and are trying to pilot it kind of for 2 weekends and then make a bigger decision for July. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that it was not about municipality support or anything like that. It was really about the businesses not feeling like they could safely reopen in time.
That's great context. And I think you're smart to try something, that's less committal on a couple weekends. That's a great way to kind of try it out. And hopefully you get some businesses who will be more open when you do it, and then you can learn. So I will be watching from afar.
Has that been a barrier that you've seen, or has anybody else been dealing with that? Or
it's a good question. I don't know for sure. I would be surprised if you're the only one with that barrier. I mean, every business, is approaching this a little bit differently with their own comfort level. So you might technically be able to be open, but to your point, do you feel personally as a business owner that your employees are safe? And that just depends on where you're at with that. So I'm sure that's something that is being weighted and considered across the country in cities that might technically be moving that same direction. I think time will tell how well utilized these programs are. They may not be utilized well to start. And so I think that's going to be something to watch.
I'd certainly be happy to speak on for Portland.
Go ahead.
So I would say that the process has been a little bit organic. There was a lot of early feedback from businesses, particularly in the city's Old Port area, expressing concern because they in particular generally have such small internal spaces. So even if they were allowed to reopen for in-person dining, they honestly had no clue how they were going to make it work. So, and we just had a lot of sort of internal conversations with senior staff about what streets might be possibilities, what streets might be challenges. And, we eventually arrived at a list. We've been sort of kicking it around. And then we sort of met with emergency services, particularly fire, to sort of figure out how we would do closures, how we would maintain them. There's no way that, we could just hard close both ends of a street entirely. So we've been, working through that. And the other thing that helped was just really trying to change some of the parameters of our parklet regulations, and also allowing parklets to be done on private parking lots. It's amazing how many restaurants are near private parking lots. But I am going to leave sort of this conversation with one thing that's been a challenge for us, which has nothing to do with internal city politics, has nothing to do with the fact that some of our staff is getting furloughed. It's state regulations as to the provision of alcohol. And that's been a real challenge and a headache for us, to be honest. We originally started identifying streets or street segments that would be very valuable, and then immediately got told, well, the state says you can't cross the street with alcohol. You can walk up and down the sidewalk all day, but you better not cross the street. And so, you know, to be honest, if we really want to succeed with some of these outcomes and we want more flexibility, the state is going to need to step up, and they're going to need to address some of these, in my opinion, outdated regulations to let us have things happen. Because there's frankly a lot more I could be doing right now if that weren't the case. So, not to sound like a negative Nelly, but that's been probably one of my biggest challenges right now on some of this stuff.
Yeah, that's great, Jeremiah. I think that state regulatory thing is something that Massachusetts is wrestling with. I don't know if they've come down yet on how they're going to manage that, but we're very engaged with a long-term reconstruction, redesign of Main Street in Northampton, Mass. Right now, and that city wants to pivot into a summertime program here to allow merchants, but a lot of those merchants aren't going to move outdoors unless they can service the alcohol, and that's the big open question there too. So I would look to some other New England neighbors. If Maine, still continues to hold back, maybe some other New England neighbors move forward, and there might be some learnings and insights there that you could, point to at the state level. But I don't know how you, as a restaurant that makes a lot of your money on selling beer with dinner, I don't know how you make it go of it if you can't service those patrons and we're sitting outside without the beverages at night. So that's going to be really tricky.
Yeah. Kara, can I just jump in on that?
Yeah.
Mike, in New York, I don't know if you've seen it in the city, but we've had the liquor authority relaxing a lot of their requirements up in places like Dobbs, where restaurants are able to sell quantities of alcohol to people, which is kind of outrageously fun. The biggest obstacle that we've run into, and it's not just because of the pandemic, but just in general, I think you were aware of that study that we were doing with the 5 villages to try and create the cycling trails and better pedestrian along Broadway. And we got, we went through the whole thing. Nelson Nygaard did the study. They did a very good job. We got to the very end of the beginning, which is where we would need the final buy-in from DOT. And we had worked with DOT the whole way through, except we worked with the DOT out of Albany instead of the DOT that is our district. So when we walked into our district people said, well, that's all very nice, but that's not what we're doing. So what I've found to be the biggest difficulty is that I've learned, once again, many times learning this, that my intelligence is no match for their ignorance.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you get caught in a, bureaucratic no man's land. That's challenging. So yeah, I think the lesson there is, can you get clear state guidance, or if things are, can devolve to, to local municipalities to make some of these decisions, that might be all the better too, since they can make the decisions, with what's right for their community. And yeah, I'm sure things are challenging in Dobbs. I know your Main Street, obviously, and there's not a lot of space there to work with, narrow sidewalks and a lot of restaurant density. So how are the restaurants managing that? Are you seeing that they've been able to pivot and start to reopen with just the curbside service?
Well, we never stopped. We jumped on that before the pause started. We reached out to all the local restaurants and encouraged them to stay open with whatever crew they would need to do, so that they would still be able to sell meals prepared to people, a lot more takeout. The real secret here was getting that to kind of go viral, to not only are those restaurants still able to have their kitchen operating, keeping people working, keeping their food going out the door, but we got lots of people who were very enthusiastic about trying to find ways that they could help. So what we came up with was basically people, we would sell, it was like tickets to a dinner that you're not going to go and eat. So we'd get 20 people to each pay $25, and that money would all go to, say, feeding the workers at the local hospital.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. That's a lot of that we've seen.
And when we got to the idea of, people who, obviously there are a lot of people who before this were not struggling financially, but they were probably 2 paychecks or 3 paychecks away from struggling. When they've been furloughed, all of a sudden food becomes a real issue. So our food bank and all that has interconnected with our local restaurants. So when we're handing out meals and things like that, you might be getting a $40 dinner from Harper's or from the Parlor or something like that. It makes you wish that you didn't have as much money,
Well, that's great. I mean, I think that's a layer to this that doesn't come through street design manuals, right? Is the community bonds that can be created and being thoughtful about what resources you do have and how you retool them to meet the needs. And so I've seen a lot of things like that, particularly for people who are in need of meals, having the restaurants work to feed them.
Okay.
And then those of us with means to be able I think that's a really wonderful thing to think about. I don't know if it's happening across Maine anywhere, but it's certainly a good model to look at in the short term.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say that when you said that a minute ago about, fitting in with tactical and all that, it actually is what you got tremendous credit for this, by the way. I did this all as tactical urbanism, that we do not have time to figure out processes that are going to take a month or 2 to put in place. This has to be responding right now with an idea and seeing if it works.
Right.
You try it this weekend. If it works, you keep doing it. If you need to adjust it, you need to adjust it. And I constantly referred to Mike Lydon's Principles of Tactical Urbanism as the guidebook that was taking us through this entire pandemic. So,
well, I can't take that credit, but it is very heartening to see some cities realize that a lot of the barriers and things that we put in front of ourselves are completely, they're man-made. They're not allowing the kind of action that we as humans know that we can take. And we just remove some of the false barriers that have been there for a long time. And that's, I think, one of the key lessons that's also emerged from this. And I think one of the things you'll start to see across the country is that some cities will revert entirely back to whatever normal was in February of 2020. And then many communities will just maybe seasonally or time of the week, allow some of these changes to be put into place with some flexibility. And hey, you know what? It wasn't so bad. We could all die in the street on Saturdays and Sundays. In fact, maybe we really like that, or maybe we like the slow street idea in our residential neighborhoods. So I think there's a lot of value that's been created that people have experienced, and that's the whole idea, right? And that experience will create the demand to keep some of these measures in place. So I'm very curious to see how that evolves, 6 months from now, and a year from now, and 3 years from now.
So one other comment that sort of brings up a barrier. Deborah King says, our town officials in Brunswick put the kibosh on reducing the number of lanes on our main street in downtown Brunswick due to accessibility concerns for emergency vehicles. The DBA surveyed the local businesses, and they were very concerned about using any parking spaces to accommodate extended outdoor dining or retail merchandise. And then she mentions, thank goodness we have a very, very wide sidewalk, so we are able to accommodate extended space for restaurants and shops. I think that brings up some questions related to public service, emergency vehicle needs, and also retailers and that sort of typical reaction that can happen in the business community to not wanting to lose parking.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a challenging, the challenge in more rural, small town context because of the way people access their main streets. Sure, people in villages and small towns and cities obviously walk. But if you're not within close proximity and you happen to live a little further out, you're likely to drive for some portion of the year anyways. And that perspective I understand around parking. I think one thing that's helpful is to kind of take an audit about how many parking spaces exist and how many of those spaces are proximate to your main street if they're not exactly on Main Street. And then also map out where the restaurants are that would be wanting something on the sidewalk or in the parking lane, and see what that density looks like. Because in some places it might just be, 5, 7 restaurants, in other places it might be 50. I don't know. But if there's, a demand that's actually relatively moderate, but would really help those businesses who want it, losing 6 or 8 parking spaces is, I guarantee you, not the end of Main Street in Brunswick or anywhere else. So there's definitely a perception there. And I think one of the things and one of the hurdles we traditionally lean on to get over those kinds of things is, well, hey, let us try it for a weekend and see how it goes at a few of these restaurants. And if you, as someone who sells, appliances on Main Street, really see your business impacted, let's have a real conversation about that and figure out something else. But if you don't, then maybe those, tables and chairs, 3 parking spaces down in front of the cafe aren't such a big threat. And so I think it's about being really aware of those issues and concerns and talking them through, but trying to get to a point where you can at least try something if there is actual demand for it. It's a tricky line to walk. I don't really understand the comment about emergency vehicle access on Main Street in Brunswick. It's so multi-lane and wide. It just logically doesn't make sense to me in terms of the space allocation. But there's lots of ways to do it in terms of hard soft closures and providing vehicle lane access for emergency vehicles is you need 10, 12 feet. So anyways, I'm curious to see how that comes out.
Yeah, if I could comment on that. This is Deborah King from Brunswick. We met with all the town departments, and because our fire department is located just off of Main Street, they needed that accessibility. We have 4 lanes of traffic going down Main Street, and our proposal was to eliminate the 2 outside lanes, so we wouldn't be closing down the road, but they felt that wasn't enough space for a fire truck to get through. And that was the end of the conversation.
Well, that's unfortunate because that's plenty of space for a fire truck, just technically, but that's a political decision. I understand.
Can I quote you?
Yeah, of course you can. You go to 4-lane streets all the time. Look at all the residential streets in Brunswick that are very narrow. They access those. I mean, that's just.
This is Margot Knight. Margot Knight from Brunswick. Thank you. You worked with us on our downtown master plan. And I'd like to talk to that point because it goes back to your guidelines for experimentation. 1 is to get everybody involved. 2 is to get permits. We did an experiment like this back in 2011 or 12, where we blocked off just for an arts festival. We only had 2 lanes going down the street. Well, we didn't talk to DOT. We did talk to the fire chief, but we just didn't plan it out very well. And it was wonderful we told everybody it's 1 day. It was wonderful for the arts festival, for pedestrians, but there was a fire call in the middle of the day. The fire department could not get through. Now, one thing about Maine towns is that we have a long memory. That has colored, I think, especially with our municipal people, this kind of let's experiment with downtown on Main Street. We didn't talk to DOT and we really didn't get this out. And then afterward, we didn't say, we learned. This was an experiment. We learned. And so if we try this again, we're going to make these adjustments. So I just wanted to add that as a little history.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mario. Good to see you. I think that all towns are listening to this can heed that message to a degree. Like there's a lot that you learn from this, and that's the point. I'm sorry that memory still sticks, and I think there is hopefully a way that communities across the state can continue to move forward with the communication with DOT and communication with the community, because I think that's really one of the key elements to all of this, is not only just being inclusive of all your different partners and agencies, but just the type of message that you're sending broadly to the community about what this is about and who it's for. It's something that a lot of cities don't get right the first time and can end up where you ended up with a lot of pushback or concern or an emergency where something didn't operate the way that it should have. And maybe there was a small change that could have been made or flagged earlier with a partner that would have prevented that issue. So I hear you, and I'm sorry that happened, and I hope that many can learn from that and won't have the same challenge.
There's been a lot of conversation about in the chat about how much space fire departments want and need. And maybe Mike, you could just chime in on you know, how wide does a lane really need to be to accommodate a fire truck?
Well, the lanes themselves for movement can be, you know, 9 or 10 feet, but the operational space that, you know, a lot of fire trucks need is wider than that, because they, you know, put out their support stanchions on the side, which tend to like take up to about 13, 14 feet generally, I think. Some engineers on this call may correct me on the exact measurements there, but operationally you need some more flexible space typically, and that can be accommodated a number of ways. But the lane itself, particularly if you have 2 lanes, if there's an emergency, a fire truck can take, you know, more than just their 1 lane to operate if they're fighting a fire on Main Street, for example. So, you know, we have streets all over this country, all over Maine, that are narrow and, you know, laneways. You know, think of all the streets where cottages are in the summertime, you know, on the coast. Like, there's a lot of little laneway access that's very narrow. So, like, thinking through those dynamics and the realities that people have figured this out for many, many years on how to respond to emergencies. If you've got multiple lanes, then you shouldn't really have that concern, from my experience.
Does anyone else have any burning questions? Carol and Gorham points out that they're rolling out an outdoor dining policy tomorrow, it sounds like. And they created it with no permitting required to make it nimble for owners. And that they did include the ability to use sidewalks, on-street safe parking spaces, and parking lots to widen the options. And that businesses would just need to check in with DOT and Public Works to use the on-street spaces. So that's, that sounds like a nice local model for people to watch, see what happens there.
That's great. I mean, yeah, keep sharing what you guys are all doing, because it'll help everybody, you know, learn. And the more towns that do something like this, you know, the more towns you can point to, and that's always helpful. Thanks for sharing that. We'll get that added to our spreadsheet.
Kittery is allowing retail and restaurants to expand sales and service on sidewalks. The Navy Shipyard is lending them jersey barriers to safely separate pedestrians via the new walkways, given the tight spaces in the Forsyth area. So that's another local one to watch. And people should feel free to keep sharing these things with Build Maine, and we can help keep everyone connected around these ideas through our Facebook and outgoing emails as well. So,
Great.
Anyone else have any questions? There's been some more conversation about liquor licensing in the public right-of-way. I don't know, I can't really follow that entire conversation, but is there anyone on the line still who feels like they have the latest and greatest in Maine, what's happening, where those conversations are going, if people are talking about this at the state level to try to make things easier?
Adam from Kittery posted a message about that the state of Maine has updated their licensing page to indicate restaurants with existing extension of premises don't need local sign off to allow further extensions for social distancing. And he's posted that. Again, I'm gonna include some of these resources in our follow-up email. So I'll put the link to that state of Maine guidance here too. It does look like there needs to be some more clarity from the state level on this, though.
Have any communities been trying to push the state on that at all? Or any of the COGs? Saw you mentioned something, Carrie. I'm not sure if you're still on here. In other news, the city of Lewiston City Council passed a resolution last week waiving fees for sidewalk and street occupancy permits. Plans from businesses wanting to use outdoor space must be submitted to planning to ensure public safety is maintained and that space is shared equitably among businesses.
Can I speak up, Cara? This is Ian.
Hey, Ian.
Hey, I was listening to all this. Sanford went through the restaurant on the street piece, or really on the sidewalk, 2 weeks ago. So my observation was that there wasn't an asking first. We did amend on an emergency basis all our standards to allow outdoor seating very quickly. I think there was a comment about fire departments there. I think just a takeaway is that communication. I saw a little chat briefly go by and say, what's the Maine Brewers Guild doing about it? I think the situation that we had was just no one asked permission. And you know, we have a very open government, so we will bend over backwards to make sure that the business is supported. There's no criticism there. It's just you know, that's something that municipalities have to work on over and over again. And then strangely enough, a couple of the facilities that did open, we didn't have to open up the street area, but it was relatively resolved on sites. So that's where we're at with these with the restaurants and opening up. I will add, sorry, I'm going to add about municipal operations, and you know, we've been open since last Monday to the public on a limited basis inside the building. It's a mix, I think, is, you know, with wearing masks in those accessible, those spaces where you can't necessarily social distance from each other, such as a corridor or anything like that. So it's difficult to make sure that everybody is doing that in the interior spaces. And I would say that we have been using, to the greatest degree possible, Zoom for normal business, but we have opened up our cash registers locations for business on a limited basis. So as well as general assistance, which never shut down on an appointment base. So that's, you know, it's going okay. I think as we get I just have to say, it's just everybody just when you're inside and in a corridor, you know, wear a mask. It's not a question of if you're comfortable. It's just, you know, we all need to send the right message.
Thanks, Ian. One more question here from Naomi, Passive House. Mike, do you have any carbon calculations related to complete street approaches? This may be a leveraging point in states, towns, and cities that have carbon goals.
I don't offhand. So there's your answer. But I think, you know, you can think about calculating that. I'm sure there's tools that are available and research that has shown gains. I think the broader thing that we've noticed right now is the drop in emissions broadly because of the lack of driving. So anything you can do to discourage unnecessary car trips and encourage walking, cycling, and transit obviously has a positive climate impact and over time can be evaluated in communities. And so those tools are available. I'm not an expert in evaluating measuring those tools, but I would encourage you to go find them. Perhaps Smart Growth America or others have those readily available on their website. But it's, you know, just I will close with this perhaps. You know, it's been, as a resident of New York City, it's been wild to be able to go outside and every day hear birds, you know, very, very clearly, you know, to go down to the river and hear the water lap against the shore and to look across the river at the skyline and see the air more clear, more clean than I've ever seen it. And so I think the broader message here is, you know, people in Maine get to enjoy that air all the time, but in New York, not so much. The broader message is how much of this pre-pandemic lifestyle do we want to let back into our communities? You know, how much do we want to invite, you know, incessant driving and the pollution and the traffic crashes and all the negative externalities that come with that? this is a moment in time when we can rethink and be thoughtful about, yes, we don't want to limit driving, but entirely, but are there ways to encourage other activity that's healthier for our economy and healthier for each other, and creates these cleaner, better places to live. And I think that's the big picture takeaway, that we have a moment to impact and speed things up now that we didn't have in February. And that to me is unseen or unpredicted, but encouraging, because we can control what we let back in and what the new normal becomes.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mike Lydon, for all your time and your perspective and ideas. It's been a really great conversation, and I hope it was useful to people who participated. The video recording will be available. Mandy, I don't know if you want to jump in. I know Mike's going to jump off here because he has another webinar for the Congress for the New Urbanism starting in about 10 minutes. So thanks again, Mike.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you. Thanks for good questions. Keep up the great work. Hope to see you this summer. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that we will have video recordings, as well as some of the presentation materials, and the spreadsheet that Mike mentioned, some of the links from today's webinar, in a Dropbox folder that we'll be sending out to all participants. So if you don't receive that, please just shoot us an email. Look for it within the next 24 hours. And thank you everyone for joining. We hope to see you next week for Sharon Wood's discussion at 9:30 on Thursday morning. You will receive the Zoom details straight to your inbox, so be sure to mark connect@buildmaine.com as a safe sender in your email so it doesn't end up in your spam folder. And just a reminder to sign up for continuing education credits if you need them, and shoot any questions our way. I'll drop the email right in the inbox, in the chat now. And thanks everyone for joining. Hope to see you next week.
I just will say, keep in mind the resource of Bicycle Coalition, and also ourselves to help connect people, and some of our other partners as well. So let's keep this conversation going, because this is an important one for the summer. Thanks, everybody.